different and very, very confusing in the tradition, such as some of the things that are said about that Pythagoras learned in Egypt, he couldn't have learned there because they aren't Egyptian, particularly. There are some mistakes that are made in the Greek understanding of Egypt. And one problem is, in thinking about this contiguity, very few Greeks could get to Egypt over a long period of time, say from the 10th century to the 7th century. Then there was a window of opportunity, but then again the Persians moved in, kept the Greeks from getting there in any great number, and really until the conquest of Egypt by Alexander.
I hate to interrupt you, Professor Lefkowitz, but the idea here is to not just explain the question that you yourself have asked, but to follow through based on the response you got.
Well, I thought that's what I was doing, but...
All right, well then, actually we differ there. Professor Lefkowitz, would you like to ask a question? Professor Bernal, would you like to ask a question of Professor Lefkowitz?
Yes, as she and the predominant view of classicists at the moment concede that Egyptian art and architecture, and she's just written an article in the New Yorker showing a particular medical view was taken by the Greeks from Egypt, why is it so implausible to suppose that the Greeks took other aspects of their culture, particularly in this period, I believe also much earlier as well? What is the reason for denying the possibility, which was brought up by the Greeks themselves, of transmission of mathematical and philosophical ideas at the same time?
There's no reason to deny it. It's just simply to try and find what these ideas were. Now, in the case of the medical thing that you mentioned, it happens to be a particularly wrong idea, and of course, wrong ideas can be transmitted as well as right ideas. And this is one thing that in tracing the history of the world, we tend to concentrate so much on the glorious achievements and the glories of Greece, the glories of Egypt. There are also some non-glories, and some of the medical ideas were one of them. I think we're all very lucky not to have been living at that time. But I would say there's nothing implausible about it at all. And there is a great Greek interest in Egypt, as you say, and that surfaces very clearly in the later dialogues of Plato. But I think that if you're going to talk about stealing ideas from Egypt, which I know you are not, but others have, then you really have to show some parallel text and show what is done. I think the idea of some influence is something that could fruitfully be discussed and pursued, and I would like to continue to do that and to continue to encourage others to work on that.
You want to follow up on your question?
No, I'll leave it for there, if we can have further talk.
All right, Professor Rogers, you get to ask Professor Clarke a question.
Yeah. I hardly know where to begin. One thing I'm curious about, I had a quick look actually at the introduction to the second edition of Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, a very interesting book with a lot of interesting hypotheses about the origins of cultures and civilizations. Professor Clarke wrote an introduction to the second edition to it, in which he stated that the first show of European literary intelligence surfaced around 1250 BCE with the publication of two books of folklore, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that struck me as somewhat curious because, in fact, as far as most scholars seem to be able to tell, the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed actually orally and didn't reach a literary form, if you mean by that a written form, until probably the 6th century BCE in Athens. There are obviously texts from Mycenae and Crete and elsewhere with real Greek in a literary form from before 1250, in fact, going back probably to 1600 or so. But this has significant implications for the idea, which some scholars have put forth, that Egyptian language was deeply influential on the first form of Greek that we have, that is the Linear B tablets.
What's your question?
So I'm awaiting the question.
That is my question. Professor Clarke has stated that this is the first form of literary intelligence that surfaced around 1250, and in fact it did not, and I'm curious how he is maintaining that.
All right.
It is the first book, and it's a book of folklore, and we really don't know whether Homer wrote it or whether Homer was man or woman. It's the first book to become known basic to the West in a form that we could study and conjecture about, and it emerged at the time Europe was beginning to show some intellectual maturity. And if you deal with this, you have to deal with what Professor Lefkowitz accused me of, not paying attention to historical chronology. And if she read any of my texts, any of my numerous guides and curriculars and lecture notes, you know that I'm a specialist on chronology. I know that one comes first and two comes second. But what I was trying to get across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society, Europe intellectually was just being born. That's right. That's right. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe, because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. A shoe or lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Joe Massey, and his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religions, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory, one of the best written books on the Christ story, where he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
No one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious that...
Except Egypt is physically a part of Africa, created by